Yeah, so my name is Alex Leavitt. I'm currently a researcher at Facebook. Today, though, I will not be talking about Facebook. Instead, I'll be talking about another platform, which you might be familiar with, Reddit.com, which was the case study for my dissertation research in grad school. So today I'm going to be talking about the People's News, high-tempo peer information aggregation in response to developing events. Before I start, I'd also just like to thank Mike Bernstein for the invitation, as well as Stanford for hosting. I'm really excited to be here. So the People's News, what exactly does that mean? It's a play on words for the sake of this talk. And it's specifically referencing a few points of interest which you might be familiar with. So the first is Wikipedia, which is colloquially known as the People's Encyclopedia, where people come together, strangers from all over the world, and participate in networked information production. So it's a system that allows collaboration from distributed individuals all around the world that creates something new and helpful. And then there's the People's Mic, which you might be familiar with the recent protests. The People's Mic is essentially a protest technique that helps amplify the voice of one person across the entire crowd, producing what might be called a sense of networked visibility. And these two concepts, networked information production and network visibility, are really key to this third concept, which I'm introducing now, which is the People's News. And when I say news, you might think of things like the New York Times or Fox News or even Twitter nowadays. What you might not think of is something like a comment thread on a website that not many people use, such as this, where you have extremely up-to-date, relevant, and informative information presented in a way that millions of people all around the world can access it immediately. So today I'll be talking about Reddit.com. It's a social news site where people can contribute information and then vote on that information to either get it really high on its homepage or hide it if it gets low amounts of votes. And I'll be talking about the implications that network collaboration has on that platform for information dissemination around breaking news situations. So again, quick about me. I got my PhD this past year, 2016, at the Annenberg School for Communication in Los Angeles at the University of Southern California. The case study, again, is Reddit.com. And to note, I have been on Reddit for a number of years now, both as an ordinary user and a participant observer. If anyone is a fellow Redditor, let's say, I am on Team Periwinkle. My focus generally for research is on collaboration on the internet, specifically around interactions on social media and online games. And previously, I've also worked at Sony PlayStation, Disney Interactive, Microsoft Research, and MIT, doing this kind of research, trying to help designers and engineers understand people's everyday lives as they interact with social media systems. And I'm currently at Facebook Research. One note, this talk is going to be pretty high level, so I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of the details of the research, because I figure that you can spend your own time reading that research if you want to. If you're interested, the work in my dissertation is available at the first link. And I also have some other papers that you might be interested in as well. The first one is a paper that was published at Chi in 2014. And that one is looking at a particular subreddit and how they coordinated to produce breaking news around a hurricane. It's a bit more quantitative if you're that inclined. And then my most recent paper, which will be presented actually this month at the CSCW conference, is more about this aspect of producing visibility in breaking news situations. So if you're so inclined, feel free to check those links out, and I can share them at the end of the talk as well. So today I'm going to talk about four things. The first is this idea of peer information aggregation and the role of the citizen journalist, whatever that means. The second is understanding what peer information aggregation is, specifically these choices and group collaboration, particularly within the context of Reddit's design, thinking through comment threads and this live blogging format. The third is, given the research that I've done, what do we now know about news practices on Reddit? And then fourth, if we can just discuss the design implications for the future. And for this fourth point, actually, given that the seminar has kind of experimented with different formats, what we're actually going to do is a quick activity at the end. So everyone will get out of their seats, run around the room real quick, and you can start to empathize with the people who are doing this kind of breaking news aggregation work. Okay, so let's start in 2012 in Aurora, Colorado. You might be familiar where a shooter entered a theater in a late night showing of the then recent Batman movie. He ended up shooting into a number of theaters, killing a number of people. And what was interesting is that because this happened at a very particular point in the evening, or late at night, kind of going into the morning, many of the general news agencies were not on top of this story. However, there were some people who were on top of this story, and it ended up being aggregated on Reddit. Now, Reddit is just this website where you can go and comment about funny cat videos and share information about the world, and no one really expects Reddit to be a place where you can get quality information that we would consider news. But at the time around this event, it was the first place that many people were going, because a number of volunteer users were finding different sources from all over the internet, whether it was Twitter or mainstream media, whether it was police scanners or other sources of information. And they helped each other by collecting the information, vetting it, and then aggregating it all into one place, creating this narrative over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, just constantly updating information for people. And what's interesting is that a number of journalists actually considered that they had been scooped by Reddit, that this kind of wiki-style collaboration was now a new form of journalism in and of itself. And we can understand, too, that news on Reddit, while it's not a particularly common practice, you don't think of Reddit as the place where you would immediately go to get news, it is a common practice for many people. So here you can see traffic statistics around a particular earthquake, and how they immediately jump when people are going to access information when they need it most in a particular situation. And as I said before, this was a unique moment for a lot of journalists. Matt Ingram, who is a technology journalist, said that this is a moment where Reddit has essentially become what Wikinews wanted to be. Wikinews being a Wikipedia-style experiment where people could edit news articles in the same way that Wikipedia could back in 2007, which never really took off in the way that news reporting and news aggregation on Reddit has. So what I want to do is essentially jump into what exactly peer information aggregation is and what it does for a community and a platform like Reddit, and then understand how design implications kind of play out when we understand the behaviors of this kind of ad hoc, high-tempo information practice. So the kind of research that I was doing was very qualitative. It's a bit weird to say that because I am now much more a person who runs regressions and looks at machine learning models. But this was very much grounded in a number of years of ethnographic fieldwork, but also paired with a more computational social science bent. So what that means is I spent a number of years in these community boards just watching what people did. I also sat down face-to-face with people for over 50 interviews, trying to understand their retrospective behaviors and their perspectives on why they were doing this and how they were doing this. What's unique, too, is that I was able to situate this ethnographic work in a very large data set, which comprised over 2 billion posts and comments from the entirety of Reddit's history. And what that meant was I could use computational means to dig into case studies, of which I used over 350, specific comments, posts, live threads, moderators, and administrators, trying to understand these very unique moments in which people were aggregating information and what the difficulties, decisions, and values are that they had at those points in time. And what this looks like is, of course, like literally sitting down and talking to people, but also digging through databases, using machine learning algorithms to understand unique temporal trends, and trying to surface anomalies that could then point me at better, more distinct case studies throughout the analysis. The people I talked to were very unique as well. So in the 53 interviews, about half of them were outside of the United States. They were English speaking, but what that meant was I could get perspectives from people all over the world. A majority of them did happen to be white or Caucasian, especially in the US, and a very small amount of them were women. This tends to be the kind of generic community that Reddit attracts. However, what this means is we have a very distinct perspective on types of participation that can happen in communities. So I would focus less perhaps on the particular demographics and more on the actual expressed values and ways in which they decide to do this kind of work. Now, what exactly are we talking about when we think about information aggregation on Reddit? Well, a normal aggregation kind of looks like this, a big mass of information, and you really, looking at it after the fact, have to kind of tease it apart from many different directions. So what this means is that people will find information from many different sources around the web and then aggregate news updates in one central location. They will find shared media from around the web, whether it's photos uploaded by people on the ground or videos produced by mainstream media organizations. It's even information from other users where people will comment or send private messages or sit in an IRC channel for hours, constantly pinging the people who are updating these threads with new information and corrections. Frequently, too, we see that people are sharing emergency information because people comment, how can I help in this situation? I'm so many miles away, but perhaps I can put people in contact with the information that they need. And what's key, too, is that the issue of visibility completely interacts with how people think about this work. So again, Reddit works on this upvote and downvote system where if you get more upvotes, you get more visibility because of the post that you're interacting with sits on top of the homepage. And so people are constantly in a battle to upvote and downvote information that they think is correct or that they want to hide so that they can bring visibility to these very momentary relevant pieces of information as people react to these developing events. And Reddit has changed their approach to these situations as well. So here is the kind of generic way that people did this a number of years ago, like 4 or 5 years ago, where they would just kind of appropriate a comment thread and continually update that until they hit a character limit and then have to do it in another post. Until Reddit developed what's known as a live Reddit feature, which is essentially a live blog where people can automatically throw information in and it aggregates it very nicely, and dozens of people can coordinate at the same time. And you can see essentially that this is just like one half an hour of a 2-week conversation where tons of pieces of information are just aggregated again and again and again from many different users. And so this idea of aggregation, this process of collecting and organizing information, becomes very key to what is going on Reddit, which is essentially not really what journalists are doing. Journalists are going out into the world and evaluating information and collecting it and producing it into news, which is this very professional product of journalistic organizations. But what people are doing here is more around information. They're going out into the world, they're evaluating what different people say about certain things, and they're collecting it for people to evaluate themselves. It's not saying that a journalistic organization has evaluated all this entirely. It's that people are given the responsibility to figure out what is correct, given a particular narrative that a user generates. And so pure information aggregation is a very complex situation. It starts with information from all different sources online, whether it's mainstream media news, journalistic information where people aren't really quite sure if it's correct, expert info like press releases or police scanners, and even user-generated content. All this gets put into this massive collection of information, these aggregated posts and live threads from volunteer people who are users of the system. And what's key is that aggregation relies on only a little experience and mostly on values and a lot of timing. So the fact that you might get there first means that you are immediately responsible for doing this work over the course of hours or even days. And participants think about what kind of information they want to include, what kind of sources they draw from, and how they will go about verifying the information at every single step of the way. Design, of course, implicates this work a lot. So the fact that you need to post in a comment thread and be aware of the limitations that the system imposes on that work. And perhaps you might be doing this by yourself. You might be doing it with 1 or 2 other people, or you might be doing it with dozens of people. There are many different ways that collaboration kind of plays out in these emergent fashions. What's key too is the process of feedback. So this constant cycle of the network providing input onto these aggregated contributions, saying, hey, thank you for doing this. Hey, here's some new information. Hey, actually, this part is incorrect. You should try and fix it. And this process of feedback going through the governance of the crowd, as well as the governance of moderators and administrators of the platform, are key to how people do this work as well. And peer aggregation constantly evolves over time. And because it is such an emergent practice, it really revolves around the constant iteration from past case studies. There's no rules, really, that exist here. And always keep in mind, too, that this work is continually constructed by the platform, because in a somewhat technologically deterministic way, the way that people see this information is because of the way that the system works. Because people manipulate the algorithms to produce visibility to specific instances of information in these very specific moments of crisis. So I want to dip really quickly into some of the findings so that you can get a better understanding of not only who these people are, but what exactly they're doing, and the complicated process of doing this work. So who exactly are they? Well, in general, participants would perceive Reddit as a viable alternative for news, but not necessarily the place where news exists. They see that there are differences in source variety, speed, and crowd participation compared to other platforms, specifically mainstream media sites. But they would find different comparisons between the speed that Twitter operates in sharing information and the way that Reddit does. They typically are volunteers who have little to no experience with professional news reporting, which you might consider to be complicated and controversial. But a lot of what they think about is how they have seen this exist in prior situations on Reddit, and how that would then influence how they do their own work moving forward. There are a number of past events that have shaped it significantly, such as the Boston Marathon bombing, which is kind of colloquially known as a very bad example of how crowd collaboration can work, because they, quote unquote, identified the wrong suspect and then made that very popular. But there are many successful examples of this as well. Now, in terms of why someone would actually do this in the first place, there tend to be threefold motivations. So the first is that someone feels like they have individual, local, or topical expertise. The second is that they perceive needs of imagined or actual audiences, so that maybe they feel like the Reddit community needs to know this, or they actually have people contacting them because they said they were local to the event. And finally, what really motivates people too is that there's the expectancy of network involvement. It's kind of like this Wikipedia ethos, where the fact that Reddit connects so many people around the world that they can rely on that network to help produce this information. What's more interesting too is the way that people think about values. So first is that there is a recognition of events based on mainstream media reporting and user-generated content information surges. And what I mean by that is the fact that someone pays attention to any particular event is because they see someone start talking about it. And frequently that means a lot of people are talking about it. For example, the Paris Marathon bombings, you might go on Twitter and see tons of tweets popping up being like, hey, was there an explosion here? What exactly is going on in France? Bigger stories tend to also lead to more response and more incentive to participate. So there are a number of case studies that I looked at where they were like local situations, maybe a robbery or a school shooting, but also these massive global events like, again, Paris, where people gain so much attention and the international community is so focused on the media being produced around it that it really encourages people to participate in those situations. And what's interesting too, again, kind of drawing from this Wikipedia ethos, is a striving for facts and objective information, meaning that people strive to find the most precise information in the moment, even though it is very difficult in a high-tempo ad hoc situation to determine that. Given that there is a lot of information, misinformation and bias kind of architecting any particular system. But these news values really do impact how gatekeeping works in this situation, where someone is determining what to include in a post or what not to include. It all comes back to the particular values that they hold. Now, what exactly are the practices of peer aggregation? So part of what you need to understand is just how Reddit is architected. It's a network of communities where you can post into a community, and there are particular social norms and behaviors within each community. But users can bleed across communities and participate in different ones as well, because they're all connected on the same technical network. And so what that means is there are entry points that vary across subreddits, these subcommunities. And it means that participants will engage with different algorithms in each community to find news in different ways. And that also means that because there are multiple ways to participate on each one, people will participate on each one. And there are multiple postings that complicate these entry points into getting involved in news production. So for example, during the Paris attacks in 2015, you can see the various activity in a number of different subreddits. So it starts in places like the news subreddit, the France subreddit, the world news subreddit, the Europe subreddit. But it bleeds into things that you wouldn't even expect to find news in, such as the pics subreddit, the advice animals, it's a meme subreddit, the shower thoughts subreddit. All these people start talking about news as it bleeds across these connected communities. And what complicates this too is you're never quite sure where to look first to find the information that you need. And so people need to coordinate as they start updating about these events. What's also confusing too is most people tend to only look at the homepage. And that isn't the only algorithm that sorts news on Reddit or information on Reddit. You can go to the new algorithm queue, which surfaces every single new item that's submitted to a community. And you can see in breaking news situations how that might get complicated because everyone's trying to share everything immediately. So here, in just the first few minutes of the aftermath of the Paris attacks, everything highlighted here is related to Paris. And you wouldn't necessarily know if you were scrolling through all of these where exactly you would want to start commenting to help people start aggregating. There are also different ways that people start emerging in their practices around formatting this information as well. And again, this kind of goes back to the values. What do I include? What do I not include? But also because you have an imagined audience, you need to understand how people might consume the information and how you want to present it to them. So generally, participants will format with like bullet points and summaries. There will be long contributions depending on the size of the event. So you might have anything from a few paragraphs all the way to dozens and dozens of full 10,000 character posts. Sometimes it's less common to use timestamps and the addition of emergency information. People do it, but it gets complicated because at every single moment when you're aggregating this information, you have to make a split-second decision. Do I include this? Do I include that? If I include this, it's going to spend time away from doing something else. People generally relied on the post and comment structure, of course, but as live threads became more popular, it was easier to add more people to them, but also harder to organize everyone and gain attention to these threads as well. Just a quick summary of some data too. You can see the varying distributions of the kind of practices that people would use. So for example, in many cases, people did not use corrections. There's a kind of a 50-50 split on whether someone would use a summary format versus a bullet point format. Frequently, people don't use emergency info, but in the cases where they do, it's very poignant. You can see here, for example, that a lot of people will refer to news organizations at least once. So there is a reliance on mainstream media. However, in many cases, there aren't people who are actually local to the event who are participating in these aggregation threads. And going back to this idea of values and how it integrates with practice, when people choose the information to include, there is a perceived relevance. And that's really key to what gets chosen and what doesn't. As I said before, there is a strong dependence on professional news sources as well. So if you had no experience sharing information about breaking news, and you had to pick one place to go, where would you go? It's probably going to be the thing that you're most used to going to, which is probably like CNN or the BBC. It's probably not going to be someone who you don't trust, who's just sharing things on Twitter. There's also a preference for multiple sources to provide perspective, but usually it kind of, again, falls back to this idea that there are sources that are trustworthy, and those tend to be generally more preferred. What's confusing, too, is you also have to keep in mind that misinformation might kind of leak in here and there. And so vetting this information generally involves triangulation of multiple sources. If something has been said 3 times across 3 places that you trust, it's probably going to be something that you include. If you hear it once, probably less likely so. And some participants do feel comfortable sharing unconfirmed information, but others will edit posts much later. So it becomes very complicated insofar as when an audience member interacts with this aggregated information, whether something that's wrong is corrected at the time when they read it or not. And as I said at the very beginning of the talk, overall, a lot of the people who do this work put the responsibility not on themselves, but on the readers of the information. They know that they themselves are volunteers, and they know that there is this kind of semblance of a feeling that Reddit isn't really a place where you should get your news. But they're doing this work because it helps get information out there. It helps link people to sources. And therefore, people should kind of come at it from the perspective of, I'm not really sure if this is true, and I should really be the one to evaluate the information as I go through it step by step. And so here, for example, you can see that a simple edit would be crossed out and a correction placed underneath. And that would be about as much as you would get for corrected information. Sometimes, too, people would use different affordances of the platform to make corrections more visible. So, for example, here, there is a flare. Oh, there it is. It's kind of hard to see. It says, pyrotechnics may have caused fire. So you can't actually edit titles when you submit information to Reddit, just because people would game that system a lot. But moderators have implemented small tweaks so that you can use these affordances of the platform to provide immediate visibility to certain information over others. Now finally, what about collaboration? So as I said before, there is this distinct difference between people who are kind of appropriating comment and post threads and just using the system for their own means to get out information, and people who are shifting more towards this developed design system, the Reddit live blog format. Now, what becomes complicated is it's pretty easy to do this individually, up to the extent that you're constantly shifting through 14 tabs in your browser and watching 3 live streams and trying to aggregate all that information. But as soon as you start admitting more people into your workflow, it gets more complicated. Part of that complication is you need to add people that you trust. And so adding additional people requires vetting. Usually this would be based on reputation and timing. So the fact that someone was there and said they would help you, that might be good enough. But maybe someone who comes in, you're not sure if you should trust them. So you'll spend a good minute going through their entire Reddit history, seeing what they post. Maybe if they're posting to like a Nazi subreddit, you might not want them to be reporting on something. Collaboration also employs explicit coordination in small teams, whereas a larger group collaboration relies on implicit coordination. And what that means is explicit coordination is essentially direct communication. It's usually accomplished by lead users. So that means that we are directly communicating with each other. And implicit coordination is unspoken expectations and shared mental models. So that's more like I see what someone is doing, and I have some thing in my head of what they're doing, so I'm going to do something else that complements that. And what happens is small teams, where it's like 1 or 2 or 3 people, there's a lot of explicit coordination that occurs. It's slower because you don't have as many people, but there's much more coordinated action going on. Whereas larger groups, especially in these live threads, they have to rely on implicit coordination because there isn't a communication infrastructure that underlies the entire system where people can communicate in a back channel. And so they have to see, given the other 29 people who are helping submit information here, what can I do to help complement them without just repeating information and causing information overflow? And finally, 2 moderators who are helping moderate the system tend to use more explicit coordination because they're already coordinated. They work every day together in back channels that they've set up to help monitor their subcommunities. And so they kind of appropriate those back channels to help coordinate other users. And so that does help a little bit as well. Here's just a quick example of what that coordination between individuals looks like. So it's just one person is responding, hey, can you fill in for me? And then someone steps in. People go back and forth, switching off. This case study here with Mr. GNW and de facto idiot, one person's in the United States and one person's in Malaysia, switching back and forth during different time zones. There's also the coordination of different users. So, for example, here, Blatant Conservatives calls forth people who he knows have worked on breaking news aggregation in the past. And they are able to coordinate bringing together a new live thread to then report much more distinctly about a particular topic, instead of getting lost in tons of comments that just kind of get filtered down in a thread. And again, shifting to live threads is complicated because people can work together very, very conveniently in one thread, and it aggregates all the information very neatly, and it shows it in this kind of reverse chronological order, which is very convenient. But you can't just create a thread and immediately have people gain visibility to it. So usually people will create comment threads and then link a live thread, and then suddenly you have to convince everyone to shift over and start upvoting the other thread. And that coordination and visibility becomes very difficult as well. So finally, what are the conflicts that arise between human and design? Well, as I said multiple times, visibility becomes a huge issue here. And these concerns about visibility really do shape how people do the work that they do in these breaking news situations. Part of the complication is that there's a gets richer trend where things that are already visible are the things that people vote on, which then just become more popular. And so if something new happens that needs to gain visibility, you have to, again, shift everyone over to start voting on that and convince them not to help with the other one. There's also competition with other posts. So earlier I showed all of the new things that appear around a breaking news event, and you have to convince everyone to focus on one instead of focusing on a few. And so therefore, timing becomes especially critical to the success of ranking in this kind of feed-based system. And therefore, there are also unintended consequences. So that could mean anything from hitting a character cap to getting something deleted by a moderator. There are just so many unknowns that happen here, and when you're constantly making split-second decisions, trying to get information out to the world, and something goes wrong, that's 5 minutes that you have to waste trying to figure out why it went wrong, and then trying to get back into the flow. Sometimes manual visibility has become a practice. So for example, the administrators during Hurricane Sandy back in 2014 just put an advertisement up on the front page, and that redirected people into a subreddit to specifically talk about the hurricane. But frequently people just don't understand how these complications work, like how the platform encounters these problems. So for example, Shanky here just doesn't understand if he can edit the title of a post or not. And again, in these very ad hoc moments, high tempo moments, having to deal with these issues really slows down the process of aggregating the work and coordinating with other people. And also to mention too, sometimes the servers just go down. So during the 2015 Paris attacks, a number of aggregators in Europe just lost contact with Reddit as a site because the servers got so overloaded with people trying to gain information. And finally, there's also design user roles. So moderators and administrators have various privileges that conflict with the user's expectations about how the system should work. So people will go in and delete things without any explanation, and that will consistently confuse people. From a moderator's perspective, and I talked to a number of them, they see this as a need for goals, whether it's providing balance or instituting rules. But for people who are aggregating information and feeling like they're contributing to something in the moment, they feel extremely kind of negatively impacted by these decisions. And again, as I said before, manual production of visibility is not accessible to everyone. It would probably be a handful of administrators at Reddit HQ, or maybe a couple of moderators who could provide immediate visibility to something. So there's constantly a conflict between the crowd needing to provide visibility through upvoting or contributing new information, and the immediate decisions that a moderator could make in any one moment. And you can see here, for example, during a Los Angeles earthquake, these are all of the posts that a moderator deleted that he felt was not necessarily valid compared to the one that he chose that was. And that one ended up being one of the first ones. And people feel like they need to contribute all this stuff. But part of that ideal situation is providing immediate visibility to one thing while also having to provide balance, because this would be very overwhelming for someone trying to find a lot of information about the event. What's interesting, too, is some users have tried to get around these situations. So they use infrastructure like automated bots. But sometimes they don't always work, and users don't understand why. And also, as I said before, moderators will delete things out of the blue. And users have to respond immediately to this as they get inundated with messages from their audiences saying, hey, why did you delete that thing? And they have to respond, I don't know what happened. Maybe a moderator deleted it. And they have to respond immediately as fast as they can. So pure information aggregation is a thing that exists. It doesn't necessarily have to be high tempo, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in the moment. But when you combine it with developing events, it means that you have this very complicated process of information circulation tangled with traditional information flows from things like mainstream media, professional journalists. And it's explicitly shaped by technological design, especially around issues of visibility. And it's extremely ad hoc, but really relies on improvised human decision-making in the moment. And that's complicated. And there's no really good solution. But as we can look at these examples and understand where those complications start appearing, we can start to understand people's behaviors and the ways in which they use their values and motivations and decisions to influence this kind of work. And then we can start designing better systems that actually speak to those needs. So this kind of aggregation is not a replacement at all for mainstream journalism. But it does exist as this kind of quasi-independent/dependent system that is alongside and augments news in general. We can also take advantage of the affordances of networked audiences, but it's key that when you're doing this work, people will probably put the responsibility on the audiences rather than the people doing the work. And that gets very complicated because you can't really do moderation when something is super emergent like this. And it's always clear to keep in mind that design shapes practices, but also it shapes expectations of those practices and introduces conflicts as well. And so unless we understand not only what people are doing, but what kind of mentality they brought to what they were doing, that's when we can start to design these systems better to help establish kind of common ground across different use cases so that we can have something that's universally adoptable and easy to pick up. OK, so this is all I have. Now I want to do an empathizing activity. I have no idea if this is going to work. I have no idea if this is going to be fun. But I think it will help you realize how difficult this kind of work is. So what we're going to do is around the room, I have placed little sheets of paper. They have a letter and a number on it. There's A, B, C, and D. And A, B, C, D refer to stages of information access. So you'll start with A, we'll move to B, we'll move to C, we'll move to D. The numbers don't matter so much as they just represent distinct sources of information that you could use. So the goal of this activity is you want on your team to create the most precise, accurate, and well-rounded set of updates about the breaking news event. And you're going to write it out on paper, which I have here, with the letter and the number so you can track your sources. You don't need to include all the information that's out there, but you do need to make decisions about what to include within the allotted time. So at the end of this activity, you'll have a piece of paper with a bunch of information and your sources. And we'll split into two types of teams. So you should find people next to you. You should have teams of 4. You can either be the editorial post, where one person is the editor, and the teams of 5, and 4 contributors. So the editor will be the person writing, and the 4 contributors will go run around and find information. Or you can be on the collaborative feed, where it's 5 contributors. Everyone will be writing information down. But you need to do it in order. So the editor can do anything that they want, essentially. And the collaborative feed Just needs to write per person. What's key, though, is that on the editor side, you can talk anytime, but only the editor can compile information. On the collaborative feed side, you can talk anytime you're not writing. But as soon as you get to that piece of paper, you can't talk around the piece of paper. So you have to only look at what everyone else is putting on the piece of paper. So as you can see, this is kind of like the comment thread, and it's more a live thread. Now here's where the game comes in. You get 20 points for each update written out in full. You get 10 points if you paraphrase it. On each of the pieces of paper, there are 2 metrics. There's speed and risk. You get bonus points if it says speed. You get minus points on risk if the information turns out to be wrong. Some of the pieces of paper have corrections on them, so you can cross out what the correction is. So here's the activity. Get into your group of 4 or 5. Each of the phases will have 3 minutes. So we'll do 3 minutes for phase A, 3 minutes for B, 3 minutes for C, 3 minutes for D. Don't look at the pieces of paper. They have sticky notes over the information, and we will reveal the information underneath during each phase. I have markers and paper up here.
Are you coordinating or are you just... Huh? Are you
enjoying
Oh, wait. I'm not sure about that. I assumed you were helping her. Oh, okay.
You can participate, you can watch.
Sorry? Okay, I guess I'm participating in this. Okay. We have to check first which type of team.
Oh yeah, I should put that back up there. Yeah. So we're going to start with A. Don't reveal B, C, or D. We will reveal B after 3 minutes. We'll reveal C 3 minutes after that, and then we will reveal D after that.
So just things that say A?
So just things that say A, it's up to you to go find A.
How do we know if we're an editor or a collaborator?
Your team can choose.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can the paper move or does it
The paper can move, that's fine. As long as the collaborative feed does not talk around your paper.
Okay. So it's got to be a little separate.
Yeah. Can I get a raise of hands just who is on a team right now? Okay, cool. That's probably enough, and everyone else can watch how chaotic this is. Okay, so we're going to start with A. Now, you get 3 minutes.
Are there papers that say A with a number on them?
Yes. There should be a couple of A's.
We're all writing on different pieces of paper.
Your team should write on one piece of paper.
Okay.
Where's our editor? There you are. Cool. I don't have information yet, but
Yeah, I think.
are we supposed to be going?
Yes, go. You should be going.
I cover the whole thing.
Yeah, so if it has A, take off all the sticky notes.
Do they know what A is? Images.
Do we go to other A's now? Or
Yes.
Other A's?
You can decide to include all A's if you want.
They won't go on all questions. Say rather than not going all. It's just right. Things they can say.
Also, feel free to grab another piece of paper if you want to coordinate bringing back to your team information from around the room. All right. It seems like everyone's already on A. We're going to shift to B. You have 3 minutes to uncover all the B's. Go.
Because it's like a risk factor. Big, and it seemed like kind of a sensational post, more so the other. That's very good. Yeah.
Remember to include the letter and number of the thing you're writing down so that we can track your sources.
Yeah, we can go. Yeah.
Is this the real event, the real like .NET suite event?
Yes.
And all that?
With a little bit of
Thrown in stuff.
stuff. Also, I'm going to knock it down to 2 minutes per phase. Speed it up a little.
It shapes the discussion. And that's these are the combination of technology and
Okay, Ezra, I got 2 more for you. 2 more for you.
Okay, move on to C. You now have access to C. Uncover C.
if your message.
In theory,
Yes. Have you had that?
one of
Okay, you have access to D. You have 2 minutes. You have 2 minutes to finish the entire thing. And then we'll tally up points. Oh, no one saw C4 up here. There's another C if you want to check it out. It might be important. And there's also D5 if no one saw D5. Also, I seem to have underestimated the value of using cell phones. All right, you have 30 seconds.
You don't know that the Reddit people don't use other communication channels, do you?
I do. They do.
Yeah, well then, that's fair.
It was a good reflection of reality.
They're probably on the phone, or what do they use?
It depends. It can be anywhere from IRC to Skype to Slack to just private messages to Twitter. Moderators use different channels. Part of the hard part of the project is it's such a mess of stuff. You have to find trends in like every possible scenario.
Yeah.
All right, that's it. Stop writing things. No more talking. Okay, how did you do?
There's only one sheet.
Okay, so how you'll tally up, do this on your own team. So for every single update you wrote, give yourself 20 points. If you paraphrase, though, only give yourself 10 points.
I don't. Did we write down any of the speeds or risk?
If there were any sources that had a speed number on it, and you can go around and check if you forgot what they were,
Okay, we can check that again.
add that number of points as well. But there were some bits of misinformation. So if you didn't cross out the ones that I read off, subtract the risk number on that source. So the ones you subtract are 40 points for A2. Yep.
Second you got. No one to win?
You get minus 10 for B4.
Yeah, we didn't write down the, so can you read what they were?
Yeah, A2 was Twitter OMG.
For sure.
B4 was local news update, a correction has been made. The correction was false.
Which was the correction, sorry. When that started that.
You get minus 10 for C1.
What did C1 tell?
That's BBC reports are coming in.
Something interesting about this. Is it? If I actually say which sports is isn't that like an idea about like people's conception would be that people had originally thought there were 4 sheep?
However, if you did find D1, it had a correction. So if you crossed out the one that was wrong earlier, you cannot subtract the points for here.
Yeah, I think this thing is like really good D1, but it didn't process.
All right. How many points? How many? 370. How many points? Okay.
Yes.
How many points for our team?
Immediately catastrophic.
Still counting? Do you have a number? All right. Also, I have no idea if this game is balanced, so don't feel bad if you win or lose.
Do you have a guess at the number?
We don't have any, it's not counting the sequence.
Oh. Well, so without the speed number.
Without speed, we're at 100. But we crossed cut all of the ones.
So no minus
Yeah.
right.
That's good. I think we got a couple. 40s in there.
You want the speed.
There was one over there too. A2 had 50. A2 was also 40. Yeah, that one.
B3 and 4 had 10 each. I'm sure it is. No.
D1 has 5. C1 has 3. If you,
B2 had, we had B2?
if you,
That was 15.
like, let's say for A2, you had posted originally, still keep this.
Yeah.
What was the question?
But you keep speed points for ones you crossed out correctly.
Do you know what time we need to be out of the room?
Actually, not until 2. So you might want to have a question.
Oh, great. You're so worked up in there. 50. How'd you guys do? We can throw them away. Yeah, that's fine. Did you guys get a tally?
85. We were a little confused about how to add up.
There's no right or wrong.
For the first thing, 20 points, like that is for all the news together or final news?
For which one?
For the first 20 points for each update.
So each of us wrote an update. So we add like 20 points for each of the entries we've made, or for the entire.
Just for each sheet, basically. It's
Oh,
So that is what I was.
oh, it's for the each.
That is why the number is.
So then we'll have a.
That is what I was saying.
Then the number is much.
A1, A2,
think we have
B1, B3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Let's do a quick Q&A and debrief. We can do that for another like 15 minutes or something.
No, I had 4.
Was that hard? I'm sure it was confusing, which it was meant to be. But did people feel like they had to evaluate different sources? Or did you just write everything down?
Right. We started doing it better.
60, right?
Okay.
We didn't really realize like what we were supposed to do exactly, but we figured it out later.
It's fine. It's fine.
Did everyone catch the corrections? Yeah? Did anyone not catch the correction? All right. Did anyone choose collaborative feed? I saw a lot of people talking. Did you work okay not talking to each other when you were writing?
I think it ended up being more like yeah.
So part of the difficulty that I have found when talking to people is, especially when you get to like 20, 25, 30 people in a single thread, there's just so much chaos. And what happens is people will say that they felt like they contributed a lot, but that there was so much repetition that it wasn't valuable for people who are actually looking at it. So part of the difficulty here is that this design is so much easier for people to use, but it's pretty bad on the consumer end. Whereas this one is much more harder to coordinate, but it's much more interactive for the people who are doing the work, and also much more easier to read for people at the end. But what is also hard is you have a limit for this one. So if you have to create like 14 threads, just because you keep hitting a character cap, because you can only put in 10,000 characters for every post, because Reddit never expected people to use them this way. That's why they developed this. So you can keep this going for weeks, whereas this one is definitely not sustainable if you have to be like, all right, like thread number 9, everyone go upvote thread number 9. Oh, we're switching to 10, everyone go upvote thread number 10. Yes?
How would you sort of classify events that are conducive to this type of reporting? Because I have doubts that as things get less catastrophic and people's motivation for reporting gets less altruistic, it wouldn't be as useful.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's actually something I did see in talking with people, where there would be some people who started reporting on an event, and it ended up not being particularly important or crisis-y. And so it kind of fizzled out for them. They usually said that they felt pretty good about being there in the moment and like contributing to something at the start. But once they realized that it wasn't taking off as a breaking news event, it just wasn't worth spending the time for them. And so, yeah, this is definitely a practice that tends to be more in response to developing events. And what I found generally is that people tend to rely on it much more in that situation because mainstream media especially doesn't have like a definitive source of information. It's all about trying to triangulate all the different sources that are reporting on it, because one news agency might have a really good new piece of information, whereas the next best piece of information comes from like someone on the ground with their cell phone. And so aggregating all that information in one space gives people a much grander narrative of what's going on that you wouldn't necessarily get from news agencies because they're competing. They're still businesses. So you'll never get like the full narrative or news agencies linking to other news agencies. And that's why people find this valuable. Any other questions?
So I guess I'm puzzled about using the Reddit platform, which is meant for kind of more slower aggregation and curation of information for this purpose. I mean, just because of its... So what would you say about why use Reddit?
Yeah, I think even the people who built Reddit didn't expect people to use to have it used in this way. And I think just over time, there were a number of communities related to reporting on daily news that started sharing news about breaking events. And people felt that there was a need to kind of keep updated about certain things. Most of the early kind of aggregation threads tended to be around natural disasters. So especially things like earthquakes, floods. But then you see that spill over into like mass shootings, airplane disappearances, stuff like that. And I think Reddit has realized that the system itself isn't conducive to doing this work either. So especially the dynamics of how the algorithms surface information and the speed at which it does it has changed over time. So maybe 2 or 3 years ago, as soon as a breaking news event happened, it would be on the top of the front page. Nowadays, it takes like 30 minutes to 2 hours for that to happen, just because so many other things are being aggregated into the algorithm, and the way that the algorithm sorts stuff just doesn't surface it in time. And so actually, they announced last week that they are officially working on changing the algorithms so that it could produce different dynamics for different communities. And it's TBD on whether that's good or bad, but we'll see how it works.
I have another small question, sorry. Like, imagine you're a reader on one of these sort of developing threads and you want to think about where you would have the most impact in terms of contributing in a way that isn't giving actual information about it, like voting. If I was thinking about sorting comments by like new comments or controversial comments, would my vote matter more on one or the other of those two sort of threads?
Yeah, so I think both, and it depends on the time during the event. So early on, the things that are top probably matter most because the comment that tends to be the most popular is the one that has the aggregated information in it. But what gets complicated is as new developments occur, people will comment underneath the main comment saying like, hey, this thing just happened, blah, blah, blah. And getting visibility on those new updates is really complicated because you have to get everyone to band together and start upvoting that. What can happen is people will private message the original editor and say like, hey, I saw that you didn't include this link, but like here's a new update. And maybe they'll have enough time to start reading their messages and then include it later. But frequently what happens is you get a message for every single comment that someone makes. So you already have like 500 comments. And then you have another 500 people messaging you saying, hey, include this link. So part of it's like, do you stay on top of the news sources? Do you pay attention to the network who's giving you information? Are you even paying attention to the corrections you need to make? How many sources can you look at the same time? I had people say they looked at 2 only. I had people say they looked at 14 or 15 at the same time, just trying to get as much as they could. And I think at the end of the day, it's just very emergent and ad hoc, depending on the person. And so going back to the comment question, like it really just depends on the dynamic at the moment. And you kind of hope that the community is able to react appropriately to surface the right information.
Has there been a method that's been found to be like more successful and like helpful for readers? Like it sounds so chaotic for 50 people to be all updating, you know, half of them are saying the same thing. Like you said, like it's not, they feel like they're doing a good thing, but the readers, it's hard for them to figure it out. Like it seems like having an editorial, like, you know, web page would be, I think, the best way to just summarize all this information.
Yeah, and I've actually talked to the Reddit team. I gave a talk there earlier this summer, or earlier last summer. And one of the things that they're debating about right now is kind of creating that editorial hierarchy in the live thread format so that you could have a couple people who act as the editors as people contribute to it. So I guess like who knows if they'll implement any changes, especially because like they have a relatively small team compared to most companies that have such popularity. But there are definitely some tweaks that you could probably make to make it a bit more efficient. So it's just a matter of if they have time.
Do you think that's likely to contribute to spread of misinformation? Because it seems like it could go that way.
It's complicated, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are some interesting case studies. The one that I mentioned earlier was the Boston Marathon bombing. What's particularly interesting about that case study, though, is there was a subreddit that really screwed up by surfacing the wrong information. Alongside that, though, which wasn't highly covered in the press, were things more like the stuff I had shown above, which were like pretty well documented updates about what was going on, kind of in this editorial comment style format. And so what happens, it ends up being kind of like on the part of the editor or the comment team to surface corrections and make it really clear that like something has been changed or something was wrong in the past. And I think where it gets really complicated is like, does the audience realize that it was changed? Because it might not be changed until the next day. It might not be changed until a couple days later. And that's kind of true of any system right now that's working on this problem. It's how quickly can you really surface visible signs of something that's being corrected or saying that something was wrong in time for people to realize and really internalize it.
Have you seen any examples of like nefarious mobs that are bent on spreading fake news?
It's interesting going into the kind of community debates because a lot of community members feel like the mods are already nefarious enough. And so just like the deletions that happen, it's like mods are awful, like get rid of them all. And the mods are like, we're just trying to like get other news that's not just all Paris or all whatever just happened. And so, yes, there have been instances where a moderator either on purpose or accidentally makes a bad decision that significantly impairs the work that's being done. Usually something gets deleted. And there have been cases where even administrators have done some weird stuff here and there. So at the end of the day, there's not really like regulations or rules around this stuff. So people kind of got a deal, I guess. But at the end of the day, you would hope that the community slowly starts to build up these norms around what's proper to do and just improve the process overall. Well, cool. Thank you everyone for sticking around. It was great to have you here.
Thanks.